It's good to be back for another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. On this show, you'll be treated to the sites associated with our fifth president, James Monroe. Kick back, grab a bowl of Southern spoon bread like they do in Virginia, and enjoy the show. Located in Virginia's northern neck, this site was where James Monroe was born on April 28, 1758. When James Monroe was born here, his father's farm was not a plantation, but instead was a small, modest farm. The farmhouse was a wooden, four-room structure where James's parents lived with their 5 children. Unfortunately, the house became abandoned over the years and ultimately destroyed. During my visit on May 14, 2019, I noticed a reconstructed birth home was being built on the grounds behind me. The young future president helped work on the family farm until the age of 16 when both of his parents had died. Although it wasn't finished during my 2019 visit, the replica James Monroe birthhouse was identical to the four-room farmhouse his parents once owned. The birthplace of James Monroe. Monroe had enrolled at William and Mary College, but at age 16 was forced to withdraw when both of his parents died. He had to help raise his siblings on the farm. A year later, young James Monroe and 24 militiamen stormed the governor's palace on June 24, 1775, and captured 200 muskets and 300 swords. The youngster was getting his first taste of the Revolution, which he learned from his uncle Joseph Jones, a member of the House of Burgesses. Shortly after Monroe helped raid the governor's palace, he joined the Continental Army. On the night of December 25th and into the morning of December 26, 1776, George Washington led 2,400 troops across the Delaware River for a surprise attack on Hessian soldiers in Trenton, New Jersey. Washington's troops began to cross the river at 6 p.m. on Christmas Day and didn't finish the crossing until 3 a.m. on the 26th. And one of the soldiers who were part of General Washington's flotilla across the Delaware River was 18-year-old James Monroe. Although the surprise attack in Trenton was very successful, Monroe suffered a severed artery during battle and nearly died. General Washington crossing the Delaware River with James Monroe. While serving in the Continental Army, Monroe spent the winter of 1777 and 78 at Valley Forge with General Washington and the other troops. Following his service in the war, James Monroe was elected to the Fourth Congress of the Confederation in November 1783, where he served for 3 years. Monroe and his fellow congressmen first met in the old Senate chamber of the Maryland State House on November 26, 1783, before they moved to Trenton, New Jersey on June 3 of 1784. While Congressman Monroe was in this room, General George Washington resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, which happened on December 23rd, 1783. At age 27, James Monroe married 17-year-old Elizabeth Courtwright on February 16, 1786 at Trinity Church in New York City. It's believed James Monroe wore this vest when he married Elizabeth Courtwright on February 16, 1786 in New York City. For me, there was no shadow of doubt cast on the vest's authenticity. This building behind me once housed the law office used by James Monroe from 1786 to 1789. Today, the building serves as a museum to our fifth president. This museum was a hidden gem among presidential sites as it houses numerous authentic historical artifacts associated with James Monroe. I'm standing alongside the personal law book used by James Monroe in the 1780s. The original Federal Hall was built in 1700 as the New York City Hall. Then it became the first U.S. Capitol building. It was here on April 30th, 1789, when George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States. Once again, Monroe followed in Washington's footsteps when he was elected to the first United States Senate. Monroe served in the Senate from November 9, 1790 to May 27, 1794, which was when President Washington appointed him the Minister to France. James Monroe purchased 800 acres of land in 1789 and built a two-story brick home he named Monroe Hill, where he practiced law in Charlottesville. Monroe Hill is now located on the campus of the University of Virginia. I was thrilled to stand near the front entrance to Monroe Hill, and I figured this would be as close to Monroe's home I would get. Boy, was I wrong. When my photographer didn't notice the private residence sign on the interior door, he carried me inside the home of James Monroe. I was stunned and nervous when I was carried into a couple of the interior rooms of Monroe Hill. There was no doubt people in the upper portion of the house because I could hear them. During my entire 5-minute visit, I thought about James Monroe as he walked around this house on the same wooden floors. James Monroe lived in this house for several years until he decided he wanted to live closer to his friend Thomas Jefferson. When Monroe moved out of Monroe Hill, he went to live at his new home, Highland. As I posed for this image, the sound of large dogs barking above me caused my photographer to grab me off these steps and scoot out the front door. Located near Charlottesville and down the road from Jefferson's Monticello, James Monroe purchased the property in 1793 and moved to the estate in 1799. Monroe lived at Highland for the next 24 years. The original foundation of Highland was outlined on the ground in front of the Ashlawn House, which was built after Monroe's time on the property. I'm standing on the location of a fireplace at the original Highland. The tree behind me was there when James Monroe lived at Highland. It was in the spring of 2013 when archaeologists uncovered the original foundation to Monroe's Highland. Monroe had originally purchased this property because he wanted to be close to his good friend, Thomas Jefferson. This white building was part of the original Highland and was used as a guest house by the Monroes. The yellow house in the background, Ashlawn, did not exist during Monroe's time there. Let's go through the door and into the guest house where photography was prohibited. I'm not sure how it happened, but somehow I was able to pose for a candid photo while standing on this desk once used by James Monroe. My photographer also managed to have me pose in the Monroe dining room as well. I noticed there was some White House china used by President Monroe in the cabinet behind me. I thought these Monroe artifacts were very cool. The chess pieces were part of a set that was a gift to Monroe from Thomas Jefferson and used at Highland. The hot milk jug was acquired by Elizabeth and James Monroe when they lived in Fredericksburg, and the open box on the right was James Monroe's personal shaving kit he used while traveling. On December 28, 1799, just 2 weeks after George Washington had died, James Monroe became the 12th governor of Virginia. After serving as President Madison's Secretary of State for most of his 2 terms, James Monroe ran for president in 1816. Monroe went head-to-head against Federalist candidate Rufus King of New York and soundly defeated the senator 183 electoral votes to 34. James Monroe recited the presidential oath of office in front of the old brick Capitol on March 4, 1817. Inauguration of James Monroe, March 4th, 1817. The old stone chimney behind me was built in 1750 as part of the 2-story barracks at Fort Little Niagara. When that fort was burned down 9 years later, the 60-ton chimney was incorporated into Fort Schlosser, which was also burned to the ground by the British during the War of 1812. Unable to reside in the president's house following his inauguration, James Monroe embarked on a 15-week tour of inspection of the northern states. On August 8, 1817, President James Monroe arrived in the area during his tour to view the remnants of Fort Schlosser. During that visit, Monroe saw the old stone chimney with his own eyes. Due to developmental needs and land acquisitions over the years, the historic chimney had been relocated 4 times. Thankfully, the chimney has survived for the past 273 years. At the conclusion of his 2,000-mile tour of inspection, where he became the first president to visit Michigan, President Monroe moved into the renovated President's House in October 1817. President Monroe, with the help of his wife Elizabeth, immediately went to work to furnish the newly renovated Executive Mansion, which had been burned by the British 3 years earlier. Not too long into his first term, President Monroe established borders between the United States and British North America, now known as Canada. When James and Elizabeth Monroe finally moved into the president's house, they helped furnish the mansion with pieces of furniture they purchased or brought from their own home. The gilded armchair I'm standing on was used in the executive mansion during Monroe's administration. These two neoclassical armchairs are from a larger set of furniture purchased by Monroe for use in the East Room of the President's house. The rest of the set is still in the White House today. This pianoforte was purchased by James Monroe while he served as ambassador to England. It was played by Elizabeth Monroe and may be one of the pianofortes used by the family in the President's house. I'm standing in the Blue Room of the White House. The Hannibal clock situated on the marble mantel was purchased by President Monroe in 1817. Most of the other furnishings in this room were also purchased by the Monroes around the same time. Besides the Oval Office, the Blue Room was my favorite room in the White House. It's directly in the center of the mansion's south side, and it was filled with furnishings purchased or donated by James and Elizabeth Monroe. Acting First Lady Eliza Monroe Hay. The Independent Presbyterian Church of Savannah was founded in 1755 and was the first Presbyterian church in Georgia. When the original building burned down in 1796, a new church, which was modeled after London's St. Martin in the Fields, was constructed on the site in 1800. I had a good view of the steeple atop the Independent Presbyterian Church of Savannah. That very steeple was featured prominently in the opening scene of the film Forrest Gump. On May 9, 1819, President James Monroe, along with his Secretary of War John C. Calhoun and other members of his cabinet, attended an impressive dedication ceremony held in this church. The baptismal font I'm standing on was original to this church and was likely here when James Monroe dedicated the building. This two-story brick mansion was built in 1796 by Senator John Brown. During his final 32 years of life, Brown hosted a handful of famous men in this home, including James Monroe, Zachary Taylor, Andrew Jackson, and Marquis de Lafayette. In June or July of 1819, President James Monroe dined inside Liberty Hall with Senator John Brown. Monroe was in the middle of his Southern States tour. Did President Monroe walk through this doorway behind me in 1819? I think the answer is abso-frickin-lutely. As I stood on the sundial located behind the mansion, I wondered to myself if James Monroe saw or touched it during his visit in 1819. Near the end of his first term, President Monroe signed the Missouri Compromise on March 3, 1820. This legislation was intended to clarify the slavery issue with newly admitted states. The bill was controversial from the start. Maine was admitted as a free state, while Missouri entered the Union as a slave state. The bill also prohibited slavery in the northern part of the Louisiana Purchase lands. President Monroe won the presidential election of 1820 after running nearly unopposed. John Quincy Adams received one electoral vote, but Monroe went on to victory by getting 228 of the 231 votes. Due to a snowstorm, and because Inauguration Day fell on a Sunday, President Monroe recited the oath of office in the newly refurbished House of Representatives chamber on Monday, March 5, 1821. The Panic of 1819 plagued Monroe at the end of his first term and into his second. This was the first major depression the country had ever faced since the Constitution was ratified. The panic was caused by declining imports and exports, along with sagging agricultural prices. President Monroe's greatest accomplishment during his time in office came in his second term when he delivered his State of the Union address before Congress on December 2, 1823. During the address, President Monroe asserted that the New World would no longer be subject to colonization by European nations. By 1850, this became known officially as the Monroe Doctrine. This desk I'm standing on was used by President Monroe in 1823 when he wrote what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. Funny thing was, the Monroe Doctrine was the brainchild of President Monroe's Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams. During Monroe's 8 years in office, 5 states were admitted to the Union, bringing the total to 24. The new states were Mississippi in 1817, Illinois 1818, Alabama 1819, Maine 1820, and Missouri in 1821. But when Monroe's second term as president ended on March 4, 1825, he and Elizabeth remained in the president's house for 3 weeks because the First Lady was too ill to travel. I'm posing alongside the original front door key to the president's house used during James Monroe's administration. The key was presented to Monroe when he left office in 1825. James Monroe became sole owner of the Oak Hill property located near Aldie, Virginia in 1805. The plantation home was designed by Thomas Jefferson and built in 1822 while Monroe was living in the president's house. When the Monroes left the president's house, they moved into Oak Hill where they planned on living out their years in retirement. But 5 years into the retirement, tragedy struck. Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe died inside Oak Hill on September 23, 1830, at the age of 62. Following her death, the First Lady was buried in the Oak Hill garden behind me, where she remained for 28 years until she was reinterred next to her husband in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Following the death of his wife, President James Monroe could no longer bear to live in Oak Hill. He moved north to live with his daughter and son-in-law, the governors, in New York City. During his final months of life, Monroe developed a nagging cough, perhaps a sign of tuberculosis. The fifth president retained his faculties until the end and said about his friend James Madison, "I regret that I should leave this world without again beholding him." Those were believed to be President James Monroe's last words. He died in this house at 3:15 p.m. on July 4, 1831, roughly 10 months after his wife had passed away. It's likely the 73-year-old Monroe died from heart failure, but it was more likely from a broken heart. James Monroe was also the third of the first 5 presidents to pass away on the 4th of July. These two relics were once attached to the New York City home of Samuel L. Gouverneur, located at 63 Prince Street and where President Monroe had died. On July 7, 1831, the body of President Monroe was placed in the Gouverneur family vault at Marble Cemetery in New York City, where he remained for 27 years. On July 4, 1858, Monroe's coffin was removed from the vault and transported to New York City Hall, where the president laid in state for 24 hours. This is the governor's room in New York's City Hall. This was the room where President Monroe laid in state on July 4, 1858. President Monroe lying in state, July 4, 1858. On July 5, 1858, the coffin carrying the body of James Monroe was reinterred at the President's Circle and Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Roughly a year after Monroe's body was placed in the granite sarcophagus, this large, ornate cast iron cage was erected around it. The locals have nicknamed it the bird cage. With a little help, I managed to make my way inside the cage and onto Monroe's sarcophagus. It would have been bad news had I fallen. As I stood on Monroe's granite sarcophagus, I had a very unique view that's not afforded to many visitors. This sculpture of James Monroe is located at Monroe's home, Highland. James Monroe was someone who I looked up to, even if it appeared he wanted me to pull his finger. Did you enjoy the show? How about the spoon bread? What about seeing my bobblehead smiling face in every photo? Well, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. Please subscribe to our channel and smash that like button. It helps our audience grow. Our next show will feature another member of the Addams family, and I'm not talking about Uncle Fester. We'll feature the life of our 6th president, John Quincy Adams. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.